Hi friends, you are welcome to Literature Simply, simple way to learn literature and language. Friends, in the previous tutorial we talked about classical Greek critics Plato and Aristotle. In this tutorial we are going to discuss about Horace, a Roman classical critic, and let's start the tutorial. The full name of Horace is Quintus Horatius Flaccus. Now we better known him as Horace, and his lifespan generally is considered as 65 to 8 before Christ. Now the scene of criticism is turned from classical Greek criticism to Roman criticism here in this tutorial, and we are now arrived from 4th century to the 1st century in Roman. So let's discuss about the views of Horace on poetry. This tutorial particularly will focus on the poetry, and we will discuss about Horace's views on poetry. What are his major observations regarding poetry? So here one thing is very prominent, and let me share it at the very beginning, that Plato and Aristotle was basically philosophers. Horace is not philosopher but a poet, and this is the great difference between the first two critics and Horace, because Horace himself composed many poems and works of literature. So here we have some of his famous and major works of literature. Let's list them. The very first is Satires book first, then Satires book second, then Epodes, then we have Odes book first to third, then Epistle book first, and there are so many others. And his fame as a critic is rests on the very seminal work Ars Poetica, which is generally known as Art of Poetry, and this title Art of Poetry is given by Quintilian, and originally it was called as, or it is one of the epistles in the series of epistles of Horace, and it is Epistle to Pisos. Now epistles means nothing but the a letter in composition in the form of verse. So let's move forward and discuss about his basic views about poetry. Now he talks about the function of poetry, nature of poetry, language of poetry, subject matter of poetry, and kinds of poetry. Let's discuss it one by one. The very first here we have nature of poetry. Now in the nature of poetry, here we have his own words. What did Horace say about the nature of poetry? I quote here: I would advise the well-instructed imitator to take his model from life and customs. He or poet uses fiction and mingled facts with fancy. Fiction composed to please should be very near the truth. I unquote. Now in this quotation we have very clear idea of the nature of poetry. Here he agrees with the very view of Aristotle by stating that a poet should imitate the actions of living beings or human beings, and these actions should be from human life, and these actions should manifest the good or glorious what is there in the life of human beings. Now again further he states that the human actions are amalgamation of facts and fancy. So a poetry should involve facts as well as fancy. It can be the combination of both the things, or amalgamation of fact and fancy. But again he gives us a provision that poetry should manifest truth, or it should be near to the truth of life or truth of beauty. So here this is the very nature of poetry stated by Horace. Then we have second point here, function of poetry. What is the function of poetry according to Horace? Here let's see. So the very practical purpose of literature is to entertain according to Aristotle, and on the same line Horace also considers the same, but he gives some other prerequisites for the function of poetry. Let me quote the words of Horace. Here I quote: poets desire either to improve or to please, or to unite the agreeable and the profitable. You will win every vote if you blend what is improving with what pleases, and at once delight and instruct the reader. A poem like this earns money for the publisher. It is sent across the sea and makes its famous author immortal. I unquote. Now here we have two major elements in this quotation. Here he emphasizes two major elements. The very first is a poet has two basic desires in the composition of poetry, that is to improve or reform, and the second one is to please or entertain. The second element or second thing he talks about in this quotation is a poet can achieve immortality or fulfill his purpose of writing if he synthesizes these both elements in his poetry. What are those both elements? One is improving and the other is pleasing. So the very basic function of poetry is to entertain and please, but here he emphasizes over the improving morality of the society. So then we have third point here in this series of the views on poetry. The third point is subject matter of poetry. Now what is the subject matter of poetry? As already Horace talked about, poetry derives the actions from human life, the actions which are manifested by human beings, and these actions and customs should be the subject matter of the poetry. Now here he again gives us very simple things, that subject matter should be simple and uniform. There should be uniformity, and it is very significant. A poet need to choose subject very consciously. The poet must choose the theme as per his capacity, so that he can weigh the weight of that subject. If you are choosing very lofty subject, you need to apply all the kinds of lofty things in your poetry. So this create an image of the poet in the society. Now here we have fourth point, that is kinds or types of poetry. Now here Aristotle has distinguished poetry on the basis of its imitation. How did poet imitate the human actions? For example, here Aristotle has given us the distinction according to its medium of imitation, object of imitation, and manner of imitation. Here Horace distinguishes poetry on the basis of meter, and he thinks that there is connection between the meter and subject matter of the poetry. Let's see what kind of meter he has given us, or what kind of meters he talks about in his treatise Ars Poetica. For example, he is fond of the Greek models, and here he has given what Homer has used to compose his epics. For example, for epic he advocates dactylic hexameter. So a dactyl means one syllable, one long syllable followed by two short syllables, and hexa means 6. So this pattern appears 6 times in the line. The second thing he gives us here in the kinds of poetry, that for tragedy, comedy and satirical verse, iambic meter should be used by the poet, and it is one of the very popular meter in his period or in his time. So iambic meter consists of 2 syllables. The first syllable is short and the second syllable is long. Now here we can say that Aristotle has given us different kind of imitation. For example, imitation of objects, imitation, how poetry has been imitated through manners, etc. Here he emphasizes on the meter very particularly, and he gives us particular measures for particular kind of poetry. For example, for epic we have dactylic hexameter. For tragedy, comedy and satirical verse he gives us iambic meter, and for lyric or song he gives different kinds of metrical measures as per the need of poet or as per the need of that particular author. So here we have last point in this series of his views on poetry, language of poetry. Now particularly these views are based on the Aristotle's views on style. These are very similar to what Aristotle discusses about the style. Here he talks about very simple language should be used in the poetry with some prerequisites. For example, the language should be very clear and effective. So effectiveness is very significant, and a poet need to select his diction or vocabulary very consciously so that he can make effective use of that diction in particular poetry. Again, he gives significance to the arrangement of that words, how a poet uses words or how a poet arranges the different kinds of words which have expressive value. Let me quote his own words. Your diction will be excellent if a clever combination renders a familiar word original, and words new and lately coined will win credit if they descend from a Greek source slightly modified. Now, I unquote. If we think about this view, we can say that the view of Horace is much liberal than the Aristotle, because he permits different kinds of words, different kinds of blends of words in different combinations. A poet can use these words in his poetry and make it more effective. It is the skill of poet how he arranges these words, how he rearranges the same kind of words and make them familiar with readers. It is up to that poet. So this is the very view of language expressed by Horace. Now here we have last point in this series, the role of nature and art in poetry. Now the very word nature means genius or natural gift which is endowed with the poet, and art means skill or training here in this particular context. Now we have a very controversial question in the literature or literary criticism, that which is higher or which has higher stake in the success of poem or in the success of literature, genius or craft, or genius or skill, or genius or art. Now here Aristotle also gives significance to the very art of poetry or very training. On the same line, Horace also considers that art or training or skill is significant. Here we have an opinion according to Democritus, who is contemporary critic of Horace. Genius is more significant and inevitable in the success of a poem or literature. But here Horace gives more significance to the art or skill or training. If you do a lot of efforts, if you pull your efforts into poetry, you will become successful. Is a very simple dictum of Horace. Now friends, these are some of the very popular views of Horace on poetry. If you want more details about Horace and his views on poetry, please go to website literaturesimply.com and read the article with the same title, Horace Views on Poetry, where you also can find the article in downloadable format. So thank you very much for watching the complete tutorial. Please like this video, share this video among your friends, and significantly subscribe to Literature Simply so that you can get more updates on language and literature.